Welcome to the Enriching Book Club, where we take the greatest ideas ever written and bring them to life for the modern mind. Which timeless masterpiece are we unlocking today? Let's find out.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking Fyodor Dostoevsky's 1866 masterpiece. But we are absolutely not treating it like some dusty, dense classic. Instead, we're going to look at it as the gripping psychological thriller it truly is. I know, you see the size of this book and it's kind of intimidating, right? But at its core, this is a fast-paced, feverish dive into a mind completely unraveling. We're going to look at the raw data of human nature that Dostoevsky laid out over a century and a half ago and see exactly why it still hits so incredibly hard today. So let's dive into this by totally subverting your expectations right out of the gate. If you pick up a standard detective story, the driving question is usually who did it? Or, will the murderer be caught? But Dostoevsky, he flips the script entirely. We actually know who did it from page 1. Instead, the narrative pivots completely to the devastating internal investigation of a human soul. The real suspense doesn't come from forensics or gathering clues. It comes from watching a human being try to live with the impossible weight of taking a life. To guide us through this literary giant, we are going to break it down into these 5 stages. The ultimate psychological thriller, the extraordinary man theory, the true prison of conscience, rationalism versus compassion, and finally, punishment, redemption, and legacy. Section 1. The ultimate psychological thriller, a mind unraveling. Okay, picture this. Our story kicks off in the impoverished, desperately overcrowded slums of 19th century St. Petersburg. This is not a glamorous setting, folks. It's a world of extreme poverty, alcoholism, and just sheer desperation. Meet Rodion Raskolnikov. He's a brilliant but totally alienated former student living in absolute squalor. He's hungry, he's isolated, and his mind is spinning in some very, very dangerous circles. Let's quickly map out his core narrative arc. In part 1, Raskolnikov plans and executes the murder of a greedy pawnbroker who exploits the poor. But things go horribly wrong when her innocent sister, Lizaveta, walks in. He panics and murders her too. This single act instantly triggers part 2, his complete psychological collapse. From there, we're pulled into an intense investigation, his confession, and eventually his exile to Siberia. Section 2. The extraordinary man theory. The motive. Now, when you have a heinous crime committed by a highly educated, intelligent young guy, we really have to ask the why done it. Rather than just brushing this off as a crime of pure desperation driven by poverty, we have to look at the chilling intellectual justification behind it. The crazy thing is Raskolnikov literally divided humanity into 2 distinct categories. On one side, you've got ordinary people. Their only job is to obey rules, reproduce, and keep society running. But on the other side, you have extraordinary people. Raskolnikov actually believed these exceptional individuals have the right, maybe even the duty, to transcend conventional moral laws. To him, if breaking those laws ultimately benefits humanity, it's fair game. He reasoned that killing a terrible, exploitative pawnbroker and using her hoarded money to do good wasn't just acceptable, it was noble. This mindset makes a lot more sense when you realize who he idolized. He looked at history's great conquerors and revolutionary leaders, specifically guys like Napoleon Bonaparte. He saw that these leaders shed massive, unbelievable amounts of blood. But instead of being punished as common criminals, they're celebrated as heroes. So he commits this murder almost as an experiment. He basically wanted to test himself to see if he belonged among these exceptional ranks. He's asking himself, am I a Napoleon or am I just a trembling, ordinary creature? Section 3. The true prison of conscience. The collapse. Well, turns out an experiment on paper is very different from cold, hard reality. The reality of a double murder instantly and completely shatters his intellectual confidence. He learns the hard way that abstract theories literally cannot erase moral responsibility. The human brain just isn't wired to switch off its fundamental humanity. Instead of feeling liberated and triumphant like Napoleon, look at what happens to him. Severe fever, extreme paranoia, complete isolation from the people who love him, and just skyrocketing irrational morality. His guilt physically manifests through terrifying nightmares and hallucinations. He completely unravels. And ironically, it's this bizarre, erotic conduct that makes the police suspect him in the first place, even before they have any hard physical evidence. We usually think of punishment as something handed down by a judge years after the fact, but Dostoevsky brilliantly shows us that the punishment begins the very second the crime is committed. The true prison is not Siberia. The true prison is Raskolnikov's conscience. His own self-inflicted mental torment becomes infinitely worse than any legal sentence a court could ever hand down. And making that internal torment even worse is the investigating magistrate, Porfiry Petrovich. Porfiry is fascinating because he doesn't operate like a typical TV detective looking for fingerprints. He relies almost entirely on psychology rather than physical evidence. He engages Raskolnikov in these incredibly intense cat-and-mouse conversations. Actually, Porfiry had read an article Raskolnikov published about that extraordinary man theory, and he uses these discussions to gradually, methodically dismantle Raskolnikov's intellectual defenses, basically forcing him to confront the horrifying truth of his actions. Section 4. Rationalism versus human compassion. The conflict. So this story isn't just about one guy feeling guilty. It elevates into a profound philosophical conflict between cold, abstract reasoning and warm human empathy. Raskolnikov is the avatar for pure intellectual pride, isolated, arrogant, relying solely on his brain. But look at his foils. You have Sonia. She's a young woman forced into terrible, degrading circumstances just to feed her family, yet she remains the absolute moral center of the story, just radiating compassion and faith. Then there's his loyal friend Razumikin, who represents healthy humanity. He's smart, sure, but he's sociable, practical, and optimistic, proving you don't actually have to be a miserable, isolated genius. And finally, Dunya, his sister, who embodies dignity and self-sacrifice. These characters surround him, providing this constant, glaring contrast to his toxic worldview. And this contrast hits right at the core flaw of Raskolnikov's whole philosophy. Think about his logic. Sacrifice one worthless, cruel life to improve the lives of dozens of innocent people. On a spreadsheet, the math totally makes sense. But reality absolutely refuses to obey mathematical calculations, because human beings simply aren't numbers. Dostoevsky is practically screaming at us that purely rational systems, when you strip away human empathy, inevitably lead to atrocity. At the end of the day, Raskolnikov's isolation was the exact thing feeding his delusions of grandeur. By cutting himself off from society, friends, and family, he essentially built an echo chamber where his darkest thoughts sounded like absolute genius. But healing only happens through connection. It's human relationships, specifically Sonia's boundless compassion and Razumikin's stubborn friendship, that become his only bridge back to moral reality. They literally tether him to humanity when his intellect tries to float away into godhood. Section 5. Punishment, Redemption, and Legacy. The resolution. The hard truth is, you simply cannot outthink your way out of guilt. Raskolnikov has to face the unbelievably difficult path to genuine hard-earned renewal. And it's Sonia, acting almost like a Christ-like figure of limitless forgiveness, who shows him the way out of his mental hell. She doesn't condemn him. Instead, she urges him to follow 3 vital steps. Step 1. Accept total responsibility. Step 2, publicly confess to the authorities. And Step 3, embrace suffering as the only real path to spiritual renewal. In this incredibly moving, symbolic moment, she hands him a small cross, representing the humility and suffering he's about to take on. But hey, Dostoevsky is a realist. He is not going to give us a cheap, easy Hollywood ending. Following Sonia's advice, Raskolnikov confesses and gets sentenced to a penal labor camp in Siberia. But at first, he's still arrogant. He remains totally emotionally detached, viewing his crime just as a miscalculation, a failure of nerve, rather than a real moral evil. It is only as years pass in Siberia, through Sonia's daily, unwavering love and his own finally accepted suffering, that his defensive intellect shatters for good. A slow spiritual rebirth in Siberia actually begins. The story ends not with a neatly completed redemption, but with the painful, beautiful dawn of one. The ripple effects of this explainer's source material are absolutely massive. The psychological depth of this redemption arc completely transformed the modern novel. Dostoevsky essentially anticipated modern psychology and existential philosophy decades before those fields even formally existed. Just look at the heavyweights he influenced: Franz Kafka, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Sigmund Freud, Friedrich Nietzsche. Every single one of them drew deeply from Dostoevsky's exploration of the subconscious, the limits of reason, and the incredibly heavy burden of free will. Raskolnikov thought his brilliant mind elevated him above humanity, only to find out that his intellect was actually a prison. Empathy was the only thing that could set him free. So I want to leave you with this. If intellectual brilliance cannot replace moral responsibility, What are the limits of our own reason when it's completely disconnected from human compassion? It's a huge question, and it reminds us exactly why, over 150 years later, this story remains one of literature's absolute deepest explorations of what it means to be human. Thanks for exploring this with us, and keep questioning.